In February of 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, officially entering what was then called the Great War. The nation's attention turned towards Europe as it prepared to send troops overseas. But in April, President Woodrow Wilson announced that the American Expeditionary Forces would be outfitted with the latest and greatest weapons and equipment. And nowhere was this more evident than with the uniforms themselves. Gone were the baggy double-breasted coats and kepis of past decades, replaced by the modern M1917 uniform designed for function, efficiency, and, yes, style. But why does any of that matter? What was the real purpose behind these uniforms, and how did they affect those who wore them? To answer that question, we can look no further than the man in charge of designing them, Captain William Canby. Born in 1866, Canby came from a long line of military men. His father and grandfather both served in the U.S. Army, even fighting alongside George Washington at the Battle of Monmouth during the Revolutionary War. So when he enrolled at West Point in 1884, it seemed like the only path forward. After graduating 4 years later, he joined the Corps of Engineers, serving under the Army's Quartermaster General. There, he became an expert in supplying troops with everything they needed to fight, which included uniforms. And in 1899, he was promoted to captain and put in charge of designing the new uniforms for the Army, a position he held until his death in 1921, in the early 19th century. Officers were given a lot of leeway in deciding what they wore, so long as it followed a few basic guidelines. For example, all enlisted men had to wear a forage cap, basically a fancy hat with a flat crown and a visor. Officers could wear a forage cap too, or they could opt for something else, like a cocked hat with a three-cornered crown. And in 1831, the U.S. Army added a third option. The kepi, which was smaller than a cocked hat but larger than a forage cap. It had a round crown and a narrow brim, and was designed after the French kepi worn by Napoleon soldiers. Since then, the kepi had become a staple of the army and was considered more dressy than a forage cap, but less formal than a cocked hat. When designing the new uniform, Canby wanted to capitalize on the success of the kepi while modernizing it just a bit. He shortened the peak of the visor so it wouldn't block the soldier's vision, made the crown taller, and modified the shape of the top button to make it easier to sew on. While some of these changes didn't end up making it into the final version of the uniform, others would go on to influence the design of caps worn by generations of American soldiers. It wasn't just the shape of the cap that was influenced by function. During World War I, soldiers spent most of their time in the trenches, where flies were everywhere. To keep them out of his soldiers' caps, Canby added a fly veil which attached to the sides of the cap and buttoned around the wearer's neck. But those weren't the only functional changes. Inspired by the British Army, he added large pockets to the uniform jacket that could fit items like a gas mask or extra ammunition. He also increased the size of the belt used to hold the cartridge bandoliers, which were used to carry extra ammunition. These belts were typically made of leather and buckled around the waist, though some soldiers preferred to wear them slung across one shoulder. While adding features to help soldiers in the field, Canby didn't forget about their appearance. One of the biggest changes he implemented was replacing the traditional double-breasted jacket with a single-breasted one. This created a more streamlined silhouette that was better suited to the modern age and highlighted the sharp angles of the uniform, which was intended to mimic the uniforms worn by soldiers in the French Foreign Legion. In fact, the entire uniform was designed to emulate the Foreign Legion, right down to the distinctive black and yellow buttons. Speaking of buttons, can you spot the Easter egg related to our sponsor in this image? Pause the video here if you want to make a guess. The original uniform design featured 8 buttons down the front of the jacket, but the pattern was interrupted by the pocket flaps, which were angled to follow the lines of the uniform and mimic the Foreign Legionnaires' uniforms. This meant there was no clean place to put the 8th button, so it was omitted entirely. This may seem like a small detail, but for soldiers used to the symmetry of their uniforms, it created a jarring visual effect. So, in early 1918, the Army altered the design of the pocket flaps to follow the same horizontal lines as the rest of the buttons. Not only did this solve the problem of where to put the 8th button, it also helped balance the overall look of the uniform. The 8 buttons on the uniform represented a major departure from the past, where officers and enlisted men wore different styles of uniform. Now, everyone wore the same thing, creating a sense of equality and camaraderie among the ranks. That was no accident. Canby wanted his uniform to be simple and universal, a symbol of the new professional army he was helping to create. But while the uniform may have looked great on paper, soldiers weren't so sure about it. As soon as the first shipments of uniforms arrived in France, they were met with complaints from the men wearing them. The material was too light and the jackets were too tight, which made it difficult to move around in. But perhaps the biggest complaint was about the color itself. These new uniforms were a shade of drab green, which the soldiers said was too dark. They requested brighter uniforms so they'd be more easily spotted by their fellow Americans in the trenches. And to be fair, their request was reasonable. After all, soldiers in the British, French and German armies all wore distinctive uniforms, so they wouldn't be confused for the enemy. At first, Canby refused to change the color, citing the importance of camouflage. But by September, the army had relented and ordered all new uniforms be a lighter olive green. Still, despite the changes made to accommodate soldiers' needs, the new uniforms were unpopular. Soldiers complained that the material snagged and tore easily, resulting in ripped pockets and jagged edges along the seams. They also said the caps were too small, leaving marks on their heads when they were removed. And while the single-breasted design was supposed to streamline the uniform, soldiers found that the new pockets got in the way when they tried to button their jackets. Of course, not every soldier hated the uniform. Many of the complaints came from men who had been fighting in Europe since 1914 and were accustomed to wearing the older uniforms. For those who arrived in France after 1917, the new uniform was all they knew. And it's likely that many of the veterans felt the same way about their uniforms. Regardless, the army decided that the benefits of the new uniform outweighed its drawbacks. It was more functional and better suited to the modern age of warfare. And so they continued to issue them until the end of the war and beyond. After World War I, the U.S. Army kept the M1917 uniform for several years. But by the late 1920s, it was clear that the Army needed a new look. The M19-8 uniform ditched the boxy cut of the M1917 in favor of a more tailored look. While the M1928 is a fascinating uniform in its own right, we won't be covering it here. Instead, we'll leave that to another creator. You should definitely check out their content. It's really great. But for now, I hope I've convinced you that uniforms aren't just about function and logistics. They're also a reflection of the values and beliefs of the people who designed and wore them. The M1917 uniform embodies the progressive ideals of the time, with its focus on equality, efficiency, and modernization. And while it may not have been perfect, it was a step forward for the U.S. Army and a symbol of the nation's new role in the world. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps me out. And as always, thank you for your support.